Here we go. Roll video.
I think anybody creating something new must have an adventure.
It's not cinema, it's something else.
My advice to a young filmmaker is to make a movie every week.
The whole bag of movies can be learned in about a day and a half.
But suspense is essentially an emotional process.
You gotta make films. You gotta make it and get it seen.
Cinema for me is a world of when I dream.
Welcome to Behind the Slate, everybody. I am your host, Aaron Strand. Today's show continues our narrative about Melvin Van Peebles and the history of black representation in American entertainment. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, you may want to go back and check out those shows. In part 2 of our Van Peebles series, Melvin leaves the United States in 1959, goes to Europe, and doesn't return to the U.S. until 1967. But those intervening 8 years are a time of great transition and uncertainty in Hollywood and are critical to understanding Melvin's future art. To help tell this story, I am joined by Christopher Sieving. He is a professor of film studies at the University of Georgia, Athens, home to the back-to-back national champion Georgia Bulldogs. His latest book, he just rolled his eyes at me. His latest book is titled Pleading the Blood, Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess, which I cannot wait to read. So please, if you are a Ganja and Hess fan or you want to learn more about this amazing film, go buy that book. But his first book, and the subject of today's podcasts, is called Soul-Searching, Black-Themed Cinema from the March on Washington to the Rise of Blaxploitation. It was a fantastic read, and I can't wait to get into it more. Chris, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So this book covers a really fascinating topic and a real blind spot in our understanding, certainly my understanding of film history, which is the early attempts at integration and acceptance of black filmmakers and black stories into mainstream Hollywood. So talk us through how this process really begins in sort of the mid to late 50s.
My book, I pick up with the early 1960s. And during this period, this is, of course, the Kennedy administration. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, is leading a campaign to desegregate American movie theaters. The side effect that comes with this desegregation of film theaters across the country is the end of the so-called race cinema. Movies aimed specifically at black audiences, featuring black casts, telling stories of interest to African Americans. Race cinema goes back to the teens. By the 1950s, it's starting to go into decline as more and more theaters are desegregating. More and more regions of the country are desegregating film theaters. On the one hand, there is social progress with respect to the fact that these institutions are being desegregated. It also has the side effect of eliminating this 40-year-old or so tradition of race movies, of movies that are made specifically for black audiences. And in some cases made by black filmmakers, although that is less and less the case with the coming of sound and the increasing expense of making movies. So Hollywood at the end of the 1950s is occasionally making movies, for the most part musicals, that are all black cast. I guess the best known of these is Carmen Jones in 1954, and then Porgy and Bess in 1959. And of course, at the same time, the civil rights movement is starting to gain visibility within quote-unquote mainstream America.
But it's sort of a strange phenomenon, right? Because the civil rights movement is really playing out on TV screens, whether through news coverage or, really, I guess mainly through news coverage. And that's really where the representation is happening. And you're ending with this weird dichotomy of, because of the delay and the expense and the processing time it takes to get a movie onto the screen, you're having these two worlds where one world of America is playing out on television and one world of America is playing out on the cinema that's no longer sort of attached to reality. And yet, because of the market forces involved, studios are slow to adapt to these changing circumstances. So you get these early attempts at trying to find some crossover. And I guess you sort of mentioned in your book that 1961's A Raisin in the Sun was sort of a first attempt of Hollywood. So what happened with that production?
Well, I guess it's a first attempt with regard to a drama with a largely black cast. So in 1961, and A Raisin in the Sun has been a tremendous success on Broadway. A lot of the Broadway cast acted in the adaptation as well. So Columbia takes a chance on adapting this property into a film. Of course, they hire a white director rather than the black director who had been guiding the stage play. There's pretty high hopes for A Raisin in the Sun because of its high profile, because it features Sidney Poitier, who is fast becoming the one bankable black movie star at that time. It's a couple years out from The Defiant Ones, which got him an Oscar nomination. But Columbia also, and I had the chance to read some studio memos with regard to the film, they don't really understand what audience would respond to an adaptation of this film. Columbia is very conscious of the reactions of the white audience. There are a number of suggested changes to the script, which Lorraine Hansberry adapted from her own play, and the film is a bit underwhelming at the box office when it finally does come out, which a lot of people within the industry and pundits outside the industry feel that, well, this was an opportunity wasted. At the same time, of course, and this is the early 60s, civil rights is becoming the number one domestic issue in the United States, culminating in 1963 when there's a number of very high-profile events, the March on Washington, the assassination of Medgar Evers that summer, the continuation of, or at least this comes very soon after the Freedom Summer, the Freedom Rides throughout the South. So civil rights and the rights of Black Americans is the number one issue on the news. Television is where I think most white Americans are exposed to black faces and learn about black concerns. Not the big screen, not movies. And I think the relative failure of A Raisin in the Sun discourages or continues to discourage major studios from making black cast films.
You have a note here in the book that I wrote down here that I think it might be a studio note here, but it said, quote, "The studio's conception of a good black film was one that downplayed black-specific concerns in favor of a neutral treatment of universal themes." Mm-hmm. And this very whitewashed language of this has to be universal, aka playing to a white audience, which was their number one concern. This seems to dog the black movie, or at least the studio black movie, for the next decade.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think the studios did not believe that the black audience on its own could make a movie profitable, that they needed a crossover audience. They needed white people to also turn out for these films, which then had the effect of them neutering what was specifically black or of specific concern or specific interest to black audiences. So it's a frustrating cycle where the studios, seem, or at least they give the impression, maybe after 1963, that yes, we want to make movies about Black Americans, but because filmmaking is a prohibitively expensive art form, we have to be able to, to guarantee that a white audience, a non-Black black audience will also turn out for these films.
And it's worth remembering as well that this is happening at a very unique time in the film industry. This is, the 50s were a time where studios were struggling with their divestment from their theater chains, with the Supreme Court case that forced them to end their monopolies over vertical distribution. And now with the spread of television, they are seeing their profits really start to be hit as more and more Americans choose to spend their time in the attention economy that we're still dealing with today at home watching TV as opposed to going to the movies at night. And so they're under a tremendous amount of financial pressure to deliver films that can keep them profitable and keep them sort of at their expectation. And sort of capitalism's ugly head is really forcing their hand, or it's not forcing their hand, it's pushing them to make certain decisions that they feel are safe.
Yeah, in this period, after the Paramount decrees in 1948, the studios are making far fewer films than they used to. There's a lot of pressure on studios to make films that are going to appeal to the widest possible audience. For for much of the 1950s,
Sorry, you say widest, but it also sounds like you're saying whitest, which
right.
which in their mind seems to be synonymous. So
yeah. They're trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience, and for most of the 50s, the studios they step up their production of big budget, special effects laden epics, a lot of them religious, Christian in nature. At the same time, in the early 60s, there are a number of independent producers that are trying to break into the industry. These independents felt like these are stories that need to be told, but it's also the case that I think a lot of them felt that, well, this is a way to differentiate our products, to try to appeal to this audience that is underserved. So in the early 60s, there are a number of independent films, some of them made by filmmakers who are often grouped within this category, sometimes referred to as the new American cinema, like John Cassavetes, who makes Shadows, like Shirley Clarke, who makes The Connection in 1961, Jonas Mekas, the reviewer and editor of Film Culture, also makes his first feature. There is a kind of an interracial plot line.
So now you've got the March on Washington, August 63, and a month later is the premiere of this film that I had never heard about until reading your book, called Gone Are the Days, by Ossie Davis and produced by the Hammer Brothers. So tell us about how this film came to be.
Well, Gone Are the Days is an adaptation of Ossie Davis's play Purlie Victorious, which had a relatively successful run in New York in the late 50s. And it's basically a satire on racism. It's a satire on Southern race relations. Ossie Davis in the play played a self-proclaimed minister who is also kind of a con man, who comes back to his hometown in Georgia with the intention of buying a church, and his efforts are complicated and thwarted by a local plantation owner. I mean, it sounds like it could be the basis of a serious film, but it's clearly a comedy. It is meant to be funny. It is poking fun at racial stereotypes, poking fun at white racism within the South. The release of this film, even the production of this film, was widely covered in the entertainment press, like in Variety, and promoted in African American newspapers and even mainstream newspapers like the New York Times. There was a lot of hope attached to this particular project. Again, like with The Raisin and the Sun, I think a lot of people were really hoping that this film has the ingredients that will make it successful with a broad audience, and that will kind of unleash a wave of black themed filmmaking. Well, unfortunately, Gone Are the Days was a tremendous flop in its initial release. There are a number of interrelated reasons for this. One of them just simply being that fall 1963 is not exactly a time in which black or white people really felt like laughing about racism. Medgar Evers had been assassinated, and the Birmingham church bombing, I believe, happens just days or weeks before the release of this film. So the film is was a pretty significant failure, even though it was made for next to nothing.
And you identify this really strange dynamic with Gone Are the Days, which is that liberal white audiences felt that it was too mocking toward its black cast to find it palatable. Talk a little bit about this strange dynamic.
This is something that also affected the play, the original play in its theatrical run. They had a hard time wrapping their brains around the idea that you could make a pretty broad satirical comedy about race relations in the South. The liberal white audience, which is certainly it's the audience that I think the Hammers were hoping for. They were really counting on support from a white liberal audience on top of black audiences, but neither constituency cared that much for the film.
It's so sad. You have this detail in your book that in the aftermath of the failure of Gone Are the Days, the Hammers never make another movie, and Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee don't even mention it in their biography together, which is so heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly talk about the play, the original play, but I believe there's no mention of the film adaptation in their joint autobiography. Yeah, which is unfortunate because Gone Are the Days, as stagey as it is, and it's pretty clear that it's an adaptation of a play, it is still, I think, a very good film, a very well-written and exceptionally well-acted film. Exceptionally well acted by Davis himself and Ruby Dee, and Godfrey Cambridge is in it, in addition to white actors Alan Alda, I think it's his film debut, and Sorrel Book. It's a tremendous cast, and it's really quite funny. But again, in October 1963, it seemed borderline obscene to joke about racism and specifically Southern racism and the plantation kind of mentality at a time when white supremacists are bombing churches and killing school children.
In the following year, after Gone Are the Days, we have this other film come out in theaters, Black Like Me, which has made certainly a mark in our collective consciousness. I mostly know it from Eddie Murphy's skit on SNL of White Like Me. I didn't even know there was a Black Like Me until much later. But so what is Black Like Me? Because it's really hard to imagine as a modern audience that this would ever be in a cinema, and yet it was.
I mean, certainly by today's standards, the premise behind Black Like Me is pretty outrageous. It's about a white reporter who wants to report on the civil rights movement sort of from the inside. He wants to experience what life is like for a black person in the segregated South. So he dyes his skin, and it is such a terrible makeup effect that would not possibly convince. And James Whitmore, who is a fine actor, played the role, and it's really kind of a thankless role to say the least. But he is completely unconvincing. But Black Like Me it's based on a book. It is based on what are supposedly real life events. The author of this book was a journalist who had his skin dyed black, and he passed as an African American in the South, and then wrote this book about his experiences. And Black Like Me was considered to be a milestone of civil rights reporting to some degree. I mean, kind of muckraking, but it was thought to be a book that was especially sensitive to the difficulties of navigating social life in the South. The film, like a number of films that come out around 1964, and again they're all independently made, the film does kind of lean heavily into the angle, the interracial sex angle, and it certainly was marketed in a way that would lead the the spectator to believe that, well, this is a movie about a white person who passes as a black man and then has presumably white women falling all over him. There is, in the mid-60s, you start to see films that, even if that angle is not emphasized within the film itself, they were marketed in a very leering kind of way, with ad campaigns designed to make the viewer think that this is going to be really some sort of salacious tale of interracial sexuality. Black Like Me was comparatively speaking one of the more successful of these mid-60s independent films purportedly about civil rights or the civil rights movement or race relations. One Potato, Two Potato is another one, which actually deals with an interracial marriage and the problems that the couple endure. In 1964, there are a couple of films in release that have stood the test of time, that are more authentic treatments of Black life in the United States. One is set in the North, one set in the South. Nothing But a Man is the one that takes place in the South. It's about a black couple in Alabama whose relationship is tested, and their eventual marriage is tested by the system of Jim Crow. And the husband he's not a radical, he's not an agitator, he's just someone who tries to stand up for himself, and he's someone who is not necessarily going to back down. He's someone who is, who demands a very basic level of respect from those around him. And unfortunately, he lives in this system where no white man owes him any respect. And it takes a psychological toll on him. And eventually he splits up with his wife, goes back to, I think, his hometown of, I believe it's Birmingham, and has an encounter with his father, who is a broken down alcoholic, that I think makes the protagonist realize his responsibilities to his wife and to their son, and he goes back to them. Nothing But a Man was written and produced and directed by a couple of Northern, I want to say Harvard-educated men who worked in the television documentary field, and who, to their credit, were very conscious of telling this story in a way that was, quote-unquote, authentic, at least as authentic as it could be. And they did, a considerable amount of research and traveling through the South and staying with black families and incorporating that, the knowledge that they learned into a script which was, to some degree, still criticized by African-American critics because it seemed to adhere to this idea of universality, this notion that for white audiences to care about these characters, to care about this story, it has to be not so specific to African Americans. The other film from 1964 that I wrote about is The Cool World.
Yes, Shirley Clarke.
Yes.
You had this interesting detail in your book that as Gone Are the Days is sort of failing, you have Shirley Clarke, again, a white female director, and is sort of notable for being this prominent New York female director. Martin Scorsese talks about her all the time. She had this film, The Connection, which is about junkies waiting for their dealer to show up in their apartment, which was adapted as a play. And, so she's sort of got this edgy take, but she's adapting this book into a movie called The Cool World. Again, we still have white filmmakers, white storytellers kind of taking control of the black narrative or asserting control over the black narrative. So talk to me a little bit about the genesis and the production of The Cool World.
No, it should also be noted that Clarke's co-screenwriter was Carl Lee, an African-American actor who was her partner at the time. So there is some input from an African American creative with regard to the script of the Cool World, but that script does hew pretty closely to what happens in the novel. The Cool World, as you mentioned, was an adaptation of a book by a white author, Warren Miller. That was, well received. Even James Baldwin, gave it a very enthusiastic review when the book came out. It's a kind of coming of age story about, maybe 15 or 16-year-old African American boy who lives in Harlem. He's part of a gang. The film is composed of vignettes for the most part. There's not a real strong causal logic coursing through the film, but it's basically about his adventures, interactions with other gangs, which result in violence. His fraught relationship with his mother, played by Gloria Foster, who was a single woman trying to raise a child. There is a storyline in which he becomes involved with a Puerto Rican girl. It's very picaresque. It's very episodic, and it's done in this sort of heightened realist style. Shirley Clarke she was an avant-gardist. She began in the 1950s making avant-garde shorts, many of them dance films. She started out as a dancer. And then, she adapted The Connection, this off-Broadway play, in 1961. And one of her investors on that film was Frederick Wiseman, who later became known as kind of the dean of American documentarists, has been making documentary films for about 55 years. But at this point, he was a lawyer who wanted to break into the film industry. He produced The Cool World, and it was shot on location in Harlem, mostly within a rundown tenement apartment. But there are a number of scenes shot on the streets. The film kind of memorably opens with this harangue delivered by a street preacher, which fairly common in Harlem in the early 60s, preaching what is essentially a very nationalist kind of message. And the film was, as you might expect, really difficult to market because I don't think even the filmmakers exactly knew what audience they were trying to attract. Over the course of production, whether it's in their public statements or kind of behind the scenes memos, which again I was able to, fortunate to be able to read, Clarke and Lee seemed very conscious about, we don't want to make the same mistakes as earlier filmmakers did when treating subject matter like this. We want to be true to the experience of our characters. We don't particularly care if white people don't like this movie because we're trying to be authentic and we're trying to, appeal to the experience of a specifically black viewer. It premieres at I believe the Venice Film Festival, and it has a very gradual release the following year. The advertising poster for the film would lead you to believe that it is an exploitation film about youth gangs in Harlem, about heroin addiction, about salacious sexual relations. So the way that the film was marketed and it was distributed by Cinema 5, which distributed a lot of these films in the mid 60s, led to it playing in a number of grindhouses across the U.S. when really it should have been seen in art film theaters, and it was shown in some. But that kind of uncertainty about exactly which audience the film is for, I think, led to its, comparatively speaking, its financial failure. I don't think it was as successful as Nothing But a Man. It certainly was not as successful as Black Like Me. My book is about for the most part, it's a chronicle of films that failed. At least failed in the sense that they did not reach the audience that they were hoping to reach, either a black audience or a white audience. And this is another one of those films that, again, there was I think a lot of expectations for the film, despite the fact that it is, it's pretty arty in its editing, in its soundtrack. But there was, I think, still, a number of expectations that the film would perform well and find an audience, and again, that didn't happen.
You have a quote here that Shirley Clarke hoped to, quote, make a black film for the purpose of changing white consciousness, which seems to be a consistent theme with some of the films that we've talked about so far, and it seems to be sort of this dual problem that these films have faced, which is number one, sort of the target audience that they're going for, and then issues about distribution messaging. The cool world fell between the art house and the grindhouse, and therefore really had a home in neither. And these problems continue to plague the mainstream black representation in cinema. We get to 1967, the year that Hollywood changes, right? This is the revolutionary year where we've got Bonnie and Clyde, we've got The Graduate, and we have Sidney Poitier in two films that are both nominated for Best Picture. He's got In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. So with all this kind of happening in the background, why is Sidney Poitier still sort of this celebrated public figure as sort of the only black actor who can get cast in major Hollywood films?
Well, I guess the short answer is that he just proved to be very popular. Actually, the three Poitier vehicles that come out in 1967, In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and To Sir with Love, he is the top box office attraction in the U.S. Needless to say, is the first time a black actor had attained that position. And it's the culmination of a career that had been slowly building, starting in the mid-50s. He has a big success in 1958 with The Defiant Ones, which gets him an Oscar nomination. He then wins the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1963 for Lilies of the Field. I guess Lilies of the Field was a landmark in his career, not just for the accolades that he received, but it helped to establish kind of the narrative pattern or the premise in a number of 1960s Poitier films, which I refer to it in my book as the assimilationist narrative. What happens in these films is Poitier is the lone major black figure who is inserted into or thrust into an otherwise all-white environment, an all-white milieu, and the film basically records his troubled assimilation, in many cases, within that world. In some of the films that he does in the mid-60s, very little is made of the fact that he is an African-American, that he is a black man. He's just, one of the cast. He's the only non-white member of the cast. In the Heat of the Night, he's a Philadelphia detective who comes down to Mississippi and gets involved with a murder case and has this difficult relationship that he forges with the white sheriff of, I think it's Sparta, Mississippi, played by Rod Steiger. And in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the problem of that film that needs to be resolved is his engagement to the daughter of two white San Francisco liberals. This is the formula that works as far as the studios are concerned.
This is their universal themes.
Right. Yeah. These are essentially stories about how white people kind of come to terms with Poitier's presence. Or Poitier's appearance into, in their milieus.
I looked this up. In the Heat of the Night wins the Academy Award for Best Picture. It's up against Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and do you know what the fifth film is?
Oh yeah, Dr. Dolittle.
Dr. Dolittle. Dr. Dolittle. One of these things does not fit with the others.
One of those huge budgeted musicals that the studios thought were going to keep them afloat, seeing how successful that formula had been with The Sound of Music. And that was essentially kind of a pity nomination.
Truly an atrocious film.
It was the Academy doing a solid for 20th Century Fox, which had lost millions on that film.
Good God. I remember as a kid, I think after the Eddie Murphy Dr. Dolittle came out when I was little, and I went back and watched excited as a little child because I was like really into like I wanted to talk to animals, of course. And I watched the 68 Dolittle. And even as like a 10-year-old, I was thinking, God, this is just awful. Shocking. But anyway, all joking aside. So after 67 and after the success of these two assimilationist films, everything instantly changes. And these stories are almost instantly irrelevant. And you talk about in your book that two major events happen: the 1968 Kerner Report, and then, of course, on April 4th, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So talk to me a little bit about the magnitude of these two events and then how Hollywood reacts to them.
You can actually get a good sense of the abruptness, the suddenness with which everything seems to change just by gauging the reception of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which comes out the very end of 1967 and is plays in theaters through that spring. And whereas the initial critical reaction to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is by and large very positive, within 6 months or so, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is widely regarded as completely compromised and really kind of insulting, just a really facile approach to race relations that has completely lost all of its relevance. So yeah, in early April, Martin Luther King is assassinated in combination with the release of the Kerner Report. And the Kerner Report was the final report of a commission that was put together by President Johnson at the time. And the objective of the commission was to understand the causes behind urban unrest, behind violent protest within inner cities that had been taking place every summer, basically going back to the early 60s. So it was a fact-finding commission led by Governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, hence the name Kerner Report. And the Kerner Report was made public in the spring of 1968. It starts off with what became a really famous and often cited quotation, which is that the United States, as it exists today, has devolved into, I'm paraphrasing, but it's devolved into two societies, separate and unequal. So one arena of American life that the Kerner Report devoted quite a bit of attention to was the media, both the news media and the entertainment media, and was very critical of Hollywood's reluctance to make movies about African American issues, very condemning of the industries, both movies and television, the industry's failure to integrate crews, to integrate the personnel who actually made movies and made TV, from the very top creative positions all the way down to the craftspeople who worked on these films. The immediate effect within the film industry was, I think, a realization on the part of the studios that they needed to do something. They needed to make a fairly drastic change. That summer, Warner Brothers becomes the first studio to hire an African-American director, which is Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks made a film out of his book, The Learning Tree, for Warner Brothers. It came out the following year. There are more directors who were hired by studios over the course of the next year, including Melvin Van Peebles, who was hired by Columbia to make Watermelon Man, and Ossie Davis, who does Cotton Comes to Harlem. There's also a concerted push to hire more African Americans in technical positions, to get them into the technical guilds, the unions. This particular quest had been ongoing for decades, really since the 1940s. Certainly, it became, a major goal of the NAACP under Walter White, to integrate the technicians' guilds in Hollywood, guilds that were famously discriminatory and basically barred African Americans from membership. Yeah, and needless to say, there's also the social consequences of King's assassination and more demands to, just to make films that actually reflected what was going on in American society, and stop hiding from it, stop denying that the problem existed, because the problem was everywhere and affected everybody. In 63, 64, it was independent producers. Now finally it's the major studios who make black-themed films. In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, while they do hint at a society that is a bit, at loggerheads about how to quote unquote solve the race problem, essentially I would classify them as relatively optimistic. That, if only both sides would open their hearts to the others, or to the other side, that real progress could be made. You don't get that same sense of optimism in these late 60s studio films. I think because there just wasn't a lot of optimism at the time about the state or future of race relations and the prospect of blacks and whites living together in harmony. The first studio film to reflect this viewpoint, this nationalistic viewpoint, and express this doubt that there could be any meaningful, reconciliation between black people and white people was Uptight, which Paramount distributed, directed by Jules Dassin, shot in the summer of 1968. King's assassination is part of the storyline. It's basically a black cast remake of The Informer, the John Ford film from the mid-30s, but set in the inner city of Cleveland. Prior to that, or roughly the same time, 20th Century Fox and David Wolper purchased the rights to William Styron's novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which had, I believe, just won the Pulitzer Prize for 1967.
Again, we've got a white author telling a story that is, the Nat Turner story, of course, Nat Turner, who led an enslaved person's rebellion that ended up killing a whole bunch of people, very bloody rebellion, had also at this point, his story was being turned into sort of a black power nationalist narrative. He was being given a somewhat heroic treatment, and here comes William Styron, who writes this book that turns him into more of a Hamlet-type protagonist, filled with all these sort of like inner doubts, and furthermore, these sort of Freudian sexual quirks. So tell us a little bit about the content of the novel and why it instantly became a sort of controversial flashpoint.
Yeah, the novel is a fictionalization of the life of Nat Turner and the rebellion he commanded in Virginia in 1831, in which a number of white people were killed. That rebellion was put down pretty quickly, and ultimately dozens of enslaved African Americans were executed. Turner actually eluded capture for I think several months until he was finally captured. He was held in jail. A white man from the community actually went to his cell, interviewed him, and his quote-unquote confession, and there's a lot of debate about the historical veracity of this confession, but was published. And Styron was, I think, to a large degree, working from that statement. And it's, as I said, it's a fictionalization that is very heavily emphasizes this psychological turmoil within Nat Turner, his struggles with self-doubt. He is ultimately unable to act. He is not much of a commander because he's just kind of gripped by anxiety and doubt. And he also, as a teenager, has a sexual liaison with another teenage boy. And Nat the adult also has this intense lust for the white daughter of one of his enslavers, which is not consummated, but which nonetheless he obsesses over, and ultimately, and this is one of the few of historical details that from in Styron's book that is verifiable. Apparently, the only person that Nat Turner himself killed during this rebellion was this 19-year-old white woman, Margaret Whitehead. From that historical detail, Styron creates this fantasy on Nat's part, this sexual obsession, which, to Styron, I think, there must have been some reason why this woman was the only person that Nat Turner killed. Perhaps it was, it stemmed from some kind of lust on his part. So the book was very highly praised when it came out. Like I said, it won the Pulitzer Prize. Cover story in Newsweek. Bidding for the movie rights began pretty quickly. And I think David Wolper, as an independent producer, won the rights. He then, he kind of hooks up with 20th Century Fox to serve as the distributor of this film. Norman Jewison is hired to direct.
Jewison is he just directed In the Heat of the Night, so he's kind of coming over with that cred.
Mm-hmm. The African American playwright Lewis Peterson is tasked with writing the screenplay. So it's a sizable budget. It's going to be a major prestige picture.
And so it goes into production. Everything goes great. It wins an Academy Award, and the rest is history, right?
Not exactly. Almost from the beginning, from when it was announced that there was going to be a movie made from Styron's novel, there is an organized protest led by Black author Louise Merriweather. She brings on board a number of prominent African Americans in the entertainment industry, notably Ossie Davis, and they put forth a number of objections, problems that they had with Styron's book, like the fact that the only romantic interest in his life is this spoiled, kind of airheaded 19-year-old white woman. They object to this partly on the basis of there being, by some historical accounts, Nat Turner did have a wife who I think lived on another plantation. But this organization was very upset with the fact that this was never even mentioned in the novel, that Turner was, made like this celibate neurotic. They objected to the fact that he seemed so indecisive and cowardly during the actual insurrection.
I wrote down the statement that they released. I'm just going to read it out because it really kind of puts you in the mindset. They say, quote, "Gentlemen, you are murdering the spirit of Nat Turner, one of the great ethnic heroes of Black Americans. You are distorting and falsifying the history of Black people in this country, and by extension, defaming the entire Black race. You are pandering to white racism and deepening the gulf of alienation between the races. These are the crimes you are committing and will continue to commit if you persist in producing a motion picture based on the Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron." Forceful words here from this coalition.
Yes, to say the least. This statement was sent to Jewison and Wolper and all of the main figures on the production. And yeah, as the final sentence makes clear, it's Styron's book that is what they object to. And it's also worth noting that this same summer there is a book published that rebuts Styron's portrayal of Nat Turner. I think the title was 10 Black Writers Respond. And it was 10, very well-regarded black academics and critics who point by point kind of refute Styron's characterization of Nat Turner, and in very heated language and in some of the essays. So there begins this long, drawn-out negotiation between Louise Merriweather's group and Wolper and Jewison on the other. Eventually, Jewison decides to drop out and distance himself from the project. Styron, this entire time, is fiercely defends his right to make what he wants out of this character who he claims almost nothing is known. To which his critics would point out, well, you know nothing of the oral tradition, the oral history of Nat Turner's rebellion and of Nat Turner's life, which we do know because we grew up African Americans. We grew up learning about Black history. You obviously never did. So a replacement is found for Jewison, Sidney Lumet, and eventually there is an agreement between this organization and 20th Century Fox, in which the film would no longer be solely based on Styron's novel, but also on other sources, and some other details having to do with the portrait that was painted of Turner as a leader. But ultimately, it didn't matter because ultimately Fox canceled the project. You could argue that had this movie been made, it would have been perhaps the first instance of a Hollywood studio making into a prestige project, and that would have finally made studios more amenable to making movies about Black history. As we know, when Blaxploitation, when that cycle hits in the early 70s, the most popular of the movies targeted at Black audiences in the early 70s tended to be set in contemporary urban America, and historical pictures did not do particularly well. The fact that it was just canceled outright was a bad omen.
And the fallout is just tremendous. Concurrently with this production of Nat Turner, there were two different productions or pre-production processes about stories of Malcolm X. There was Columbia had the autobiography of Malcolm X, and Fox also had Malcolm X, the script written by James Baldwin.
I think it was the other way around. I think Columbia.
Oh, apologies.
Columbia was brought on James Baldwin to adapt the Alex Haley book.
And so in the aftermath of the Nat Turner cancellation, you have both these projects scrapped, and then, like you said, there wasn't a major studio commitment to a big budget Black cast prestige historical picture until The Color Purple in 1985. I mean, this is just astounding.
You could argue that only someone with the power in the film industry and the clout of Steven Spielberg in the mid-'80s could have got that movie produced.
The fallout is also twofold in that the controversy around the portrayal of Nat Turner in this film then sort of creates what will become the macho and sort of decisive hero that will come to frame the rest of the Blaxploitation film movement. So talk a little bit about how the fallout of Nat Turner then led to the quote-unquote Blaxploitation hero.
Well, I want to be careful in asserting a direct relationship. I don't want to imply that Black activists or activist group such as Louise Merriweather's organization are responsible for the one-dimensionality of the Blaxploitation hero in the early 70s. The fact that the William Styron version of Nat Turner was objected to so vociferously, seemingly on the grounds that Black audiences, politically conscious Black audiences or Black viewers, did not want a indecisive, neurotic, hesitant Nat Turner, and you can certainly understand why this would be at the end of the 1960s. They wanted heroes. They wanted to promote historical figures who had been freedom fighters and who they hoped would serve as models for for a new generation of activism, more along the lines of Malcolm X than Martin Luther King. The studios may have concluded from this that we're going to get in trouble if we make movies about Black protagonists in which they are depicted as weak, in which they are depicted as not sufficiently committed to the cause of Black liberation. And I think the lesson that they took from that metamorphosed into what we have at the beginning of the 1970s, when MGM produces Shaft, when Warner Brothers distributes Superfly, movies featuring Black superheroes, featuring and usually on the quote unquote right side of the law. Often these the protagonists in blaxploitation films are police officers, detectives, crime fighters. The lessons that the studios may have taken from the failure of the cancellation of the Nat Turner project was to basically purposefully simplify Black characterization and to cater to a mentality of, okay, you want Black heroes, we're going to give you Black heroes, and so, yeah, we're going to show them kicking ass, we're going to show them victorious. As the early 1970s Black critics of blaxploitation would point out, this is not exactly what best serves the Black audience either. These are stereotypes. These are completely one-dimensional characters who, have no interiority. But it's the formula that financially seemed to work. Movies like Dr. Dolittle kind of conclusively showed to the studios that there is no longer a mass audience. We can no longer count on there being this undifferentiated popular audience who are all interested in seeing the same kind of movie. And especially there's a pretty crippling recession in Hollywood in 1969. We have to start making movies. Maybe they're not going to, set the world on fire at the box office, but at least they will appeal to a certain important demographic, and they will be profitable enough. So as long as you could keep budgets low, much lower than what had been budgeted, what had been planned for the Confessions of Nat Turner. As long as you keep budgets low, you don't even need stars. You just need this formula, and you're going to make, dependable profits.
It's just a fascinating story about a fascinating decade in film history, and I really encourage everybody to go out and buy the book, because we are just barely kind of touching the surface here. Chris provides so many details. There's quoted memos from in the studio setting or from these independent producers. I mean, it is just really, really fascinating stuff. So I encourage everybody to go out and buy soul-searching Black-themed cinema, from the March on Washington to the Rise of Blaxploitation. You can get it wherever books are sold. And it's just amazing. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it and learned a lot from this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
Yeah. Is there a place where people can follow you, find out about your future work, anything like that?
Yeah, you can probably find me pretty easily on Twitter, just by my name, Christopher Sieving. And yeah, I've got some pinned tweets regarding my more recent book on Ganja and Hess, and yeah, hopefully that some people listening to this would find that interesting as well.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you so much again, and until next time, that's a wrap.